few announcements. Our next Friday forum, July 22nd, is on the health of the Oregon State Hospital with Bob Nickel, Administrator of the Office of Mental Health and Addiction Services of the Oregon Department of Human Services. If you haven't already, I'd ask you, there should be cards at your table, to fill out your answers to our annual community scan, which asks you to help us with our programming choices and our research choices. What you think are the top 2 local or regional issues of public importance. Why are these issues important? And are these immediate concerns or emerging long-term issues? So there are cards on your table. If you wouldn't mind filling those out and giving them back to the staff, we'd appreciate that. They're also available on our website. I want to remind you that our Citizens Read book group will be meeting on July 25th at City Club Commons at 7:15 to discuss Ian McEwen's book, Saturday. We're continuing our Citizen Salons program this summer. Next week's 2 salons are sold out, but we have 5 more coming up, including a new September date for The Little Indie That Could, featuring guest provocateurs Mark Zussman and Nigel Jaquist of Willamette Week. Brochures are available at the registration table, or you can check our website and then call the office to make reservations for the salons. Details on all of these items can be found in your bulletin or online at www.pdxcityclub.org. While you're at our website, you can also find information on membership, our TV and radio broadcast schedule, and of course our Citizens Blog online forum. You can also listen to today's forum online, or we'll have audio CDs and videotapes available for purchase. Our sponsors this quarter are Kaiser Permanente and Nike Incorporated. And would you please join me in thanking our sponsors? Our program today is Politics in the Pulpit, the Role of Religion in Public Life. The first sentence of the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights is, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That sentence established the line we now call the separation of church and state. How sharp that line is or how blurry continues to be a central debate in our country. And recent examples are the Supreme Court's decision on the display of the 10 Commandments in public buildings and the Bush administration's focus on faith-based initiatives in the delivery of public services. Our speakers today are nationally recognized participants in this debate. David Crowe is founder and executive director of Restore America, a Christian ministry dedicated to restoration and preservation of America as a nation under God. He's an ordained minister and speaks frequently on Americans' Christian heritage and the responsibility of evangelical Christians to participate in civil government and the elective process. He's married to Marilee, his wife of 38 years, has 2 adult sons, and lives in Tigard. Stephen K. Green is an associate professor of law at Willamette University. Professor Green joined the Willamette faculty in August 2001 after serving 9 years as general counsel and director of policy for Americans United for Separation of Church and State, a national public interest organization in Washington, D.C. that concentrates on First Amendment issues. He's participated in several cases before the Supreme Court and is currently writing a case book on church-state law to be published by Baylor University Press. So I will turn this program over first to you, David.
Religion, as I said, does play a vital role in American public life, and it has from the very beginning. Christianity is, in fact, the historical underpinning of our jurisprudence, the Declaration of Independence, and our Constitution. In 1954, Chief Justice Earl Warren said, and I quote, "I believe no one can read the history of our country without realizing that the good book and the spirit of the Savior have from the beginning been our guiding geniuses. Whether we look to the first charter of Virginia or to the charter of New England or the charter of Massachusetts Bay, or to the fundamental orders of Connecticut, the same objective is present, a Christian land governed by Christian principles." Warren went on to say, "I believe that the entire Bill of Rights came into being because of the knowledge our forefathers had of the Bible and their belief in it. freedom of belief, of expression, of assembly, of petition, the dignity of the individual, the sanctity of the home, equal justice under law, and the reservation of powers to the people. Herb Titus, former law professor at the University of Oregon and constitutional scholar, wrote, "From the beginning of America's colonial history to its founding as a nation, the people chose to put in writing the purpose and form of their civil governments. So what were the origins of this written constitutional tradition to which Chief Justice Warren and Professor Titus referred? Was it the Greeks, the Romans, the Enlightenment? According to Titus and numerous other authorities, the answer is none of the above. In 1870, Emilio Castelar, the great Spanish statesman, made the following statement to the Constitutional Assembly of Spain: "The French democracy has a glorious lineage of ideas. The science of Descartes, the criticism of Voltaire, the pen of Rousseau, and the Anglo-Saxon democracy has for its lineage a book of primitive society, the Bible." Castelar went on to say, and I quote, "The French democracy is the product of all modern philosophy. The Anglo-Saxon democracy is the product of a severe theology learned by a few Christian fugitives in the gloomy cities of Holland and Switzerland. The French democracy has passed like an orgy of the human spirit drunken with ideas, while the Anglo-Saxon democracy remains." Titus states, the theology to which Castelar referred was none other than Puritan. At the heart of the Puritan theology of civil government was the written civil covenant to define the nature and purpose of the civil order and to govern the power of the nation's rulers. The Mayflower Compact, written in 1620 by the Pilgrims who came from Holland, was the first uniquely American civil compact. That compact formed a civil body politic and thereby put into effect the Puritan theology of covenant. In 1972, an American Bar Association Foundation study verified this connection between constitutional government in America and the biblical idea of covenant. It said the Mayflower document represents the application to the affairs of civil government of the philosophy of the church covenant. This theology found in the scriptures the right of men to associate and covenant to form a church and a civil government, and to choose their own officers to administer both religious and civil affairs. Titus goes on to say that same study also confirmed that the biblical covenant idea spawned the first truly authentic political constitution in the New World, the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, to which Chief Justice Warren referred. Historian George Leon Walker wrote in 1884 that the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut were said to be the first written constitution in the history of nations. According to John Fiske in his 1889 work titled Beginnings of New England, the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut were inspired by a 1638 sermon preached by the Reverend Thomas Hooker, founder of the colony. Fiske wrote that Hooker maintained that, and I quote, "The foundation of authority is laid in the free consent of the people, that the choice of public magistrates belongs unto the people by God's own allowance, and that they who have the power to appoint officers and magistrates have the right also to set the bounds and limitations of the power and place unto which they call them." Fiske stated that the government of the United States today is in lineal descent, more nearly related to that of Connecticut than to that of any of the other 13 colonies. Constitutional scholar, author, and attorney David Gibbs Jr. states, and a growing number of scholars agree, that it was in reality the Puritan practice of church covenant that gave rise to the concept of political covenants, compacts, and written constitutions. And it began in America as the Mayflower Compact said, "In the name of God, amen," which means, so be it. But what about the federal Constitution that our founders drafted, approved, and gave to us? Is it a product of Enlightenment thinking, a secular document created by deists, and not a Christian-based document, as many of our contemporaries would have us believe? In 1870, Castelar didn't think so, but is there proof? For proof, we must go to the writings of the time of the Declaration of Independence and Constitution itself. When we do so, we find it was the Bible, not the Enlightenment, that most influenced our founders. 19th century American historian George Bancroft, along with many other historians, as well as Titus and Gibbs, say it was biblically based Christian Enlightenment thinkers Montesquieu and John Locke, along with legal philosopher Sir William Blackstone, who most influenced American political thinking during the founding era, not Voltaire and others, and the facts bear this out. About 20 years ago, two political science professors, Donald Lutz and Charles Heinemann, conducted a massive study of nearly 15,000 documents, including books, monographs, pamphlets, and newspaper articles written between 1760 and 1805, analyzing their political content. Of the 3,154 citations or references to other sources, the source quoted most often was the Bible by a 4-to-1 margin. Their authority was clearly the Bible and the laws of God. The top three sources quoted after the Bible were Montesquieu, 8.3%, Blackstone, 8%, and John Locke at 3%. Montesquieu, who lived between 1689 and 1755, in his work, The Spirit of the Laws, wrote that God is the source of all law. He said, quote, God is related to the universe as creator and preserver. The laws by which he created all things are those by which he preserves them. He acts according to these rules because he knows them, because he made them, and he made them because they are in relation to his wisdom and power, end quote. John Locke, who lived between 1632 and 1704, who wrote nearly 100 years before Blackstone, said, and I quote, the law of nature stands as an eternal rule of all men, legislators as well as others. The rules that they make for other men's actions must be conformable to the law of nature, i.e., to the will of God. Sir William Blackstone, the renowned British jurist, said the laws of nature, being the exact expression of God's will for all creation, including mankind, were binding over all the globe, in all countries, and at all times. No human laws are of any validity if contrary to this, end quote. Further, he said, and I quote, man must necessarily be subject to the laws of his creator, for he is an entirely dependent being, and consequently, as man absolutely depends upon his maker for everything, it is necessary that he should in all points conform to his maker's will. This will of his maker is called the law of nature. In 1775, Edmund Burke, the great British statesman, stated in Parliament that Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England were perhaps more popular in the colonies than they were in Britain, that they have sold nearly as many in America as in England, and that the colonists have now fallen into the way of printing them for their own use. The laws of nature and of nature's God were the basis for the founders' declaration that the 13 colonies were free and independent from the authority of the King of England and his Parliament. Why? Because the King and Parliament were violating the laws of nature and of nature's God, as Jefferson would so ably point out, citing 28 violations. So what does this have to do with the Constitution? It demonstrates that the founders were far more interested in what the Bible said and taught than they were in Enlightenment philosophy. Those who wish to deny the influence of Christianity on the Constitution, calling it a secular document only, argue that the Constitution does not mention God. What they fail to understand is that the Declaration of Independence declared the foundational principles of freedom, justice, and dependence on God, and that the Constitution merely added the rules by which the nation would be governed. In 1897, the U.S. Supreme Court, speaking of the relationship of the Constitution to the Declaration, said as follows: while such declaration of principles may not have the force of organic law, meaning the Constitution, or be made the basis of judicial decision as to the limits of right and duty, and while in all cases reference must be had to the organic law of the nation for such limits, yet the latter is but the body and the letter of which the former is the thought and the spirit. And it is always safe to read the letter of the Constitution in the spirit of the Declaration of Independence. It has been said that the Declaration is the why of American government, while the Constitution is the how. Further, those who argue against the Christian influence on the Constitution fail to consider the subscription clause. The subscription clause reads as follows: done in convention by the unanimous consent of the states present, the 17th day of September, in the year of our Lord, 1787, and of the independence of the United States the 12th, in witness whereof we have hereunto subscribed our names. The subscription clause established the date that the Constitution was approved for submission to the people for ratification. It also established that 1787 was the 12th year of the independent existence of the nation called the United States of America. Herb Titus says that by acknowledging these two historical facts, the subscription clause has connected the Constitution to the God of the Bible and to the Christian foundations of the nation. And here is how. Unlike the French Revolution 2 years later, the American patriots embraced God and stayed with the Christian calendar anchored to the birth of Christ. The French, on the other hand, rejected God, declared the first year of the French Republic to be the year 1, and the day after the Revolution to be the first day of the year. In addition, the new French calendar eliminated the 7-day week, substituting a 10-day week. The founders instead chose to honor Sunday as the day of rest, enshrining that day in Article 1, Section 7 of their new Constitution as an exception in counting the days within which a president must veto a measure of Congress. By adopting the Constitution in the 12th year of the nation's independence, they affirmed God and his laws as the foundation of the American legal and political order. And by reference to the Declaration of Independence as the charter of the nation. By embracing the Declaration as the nation's founding charter, the Constitution expressly proclaimed that it must be read consistent with that charter. But has it? Up until 1947, it had been. Since then, much has changed. On July 5th of this year, constitutional scholar Robert Bork said in the Wall Street Journal, and I quote, "The justices have weakened the authority of other institutions, public and private, such as schools, business, and churches, assisted in sapping the vitality of religion through a transparently false interpretation of the Establishment Clause, denigrated marriage and family, destroyed taboos about vile language in public, protected as free speech the basest pornography, including computer-simulated child pornography, weakened political parties, and permitted prior restraints on political speech, violating the core of the First Amendment guarantee of freedom of speech, created a right to abortion virtually on demand, invalidating the laws of all 50 states, whittled down capital punishment on the path apparently to abolishing it entirely, mounted a campaign to normalize homosexuality, culminating soon, it seems obvious, in a right to homosexual marriage, permitted racial and gender discrimination at the expense of white males, and made the criminal justice system needlessly slow and complex, tipping the balance in favor of criminals." Bork went on to say, whatever one may think of these outcomes as matters of policy, not one is authorized by the Constitution, and some are directly contrary to it. All of them, however, are consistent with the left liberal liberationist impulse that advances moral anarchy, end quote. Woodrow Wilson, our 28th President of the United States, said, "A nation that does not remember what it was yesterday does not know what it is today nor what it is trying to do. We are trying to do a futile thing if we do not know where we came from or what we have been about. We would do well to recall our Christian heritage and that the liberty of our founders was not licentious liberty, but virtuous liberty, that our Constitution is a covenant document based on the wisdom and principles of the Bible. Of the approximately 250 men who were founders playing a leadership role from declaring our independence from Britain to ratifying the Constitution, all but 12 were serious Christians. Many were pastors. They believed the Bible was in fact the authority on morality, civility, and good government. Most were founders and members of various Bible societies and missionary groups, not deists, as many would lead us to believe. What the Constitution gave us is invaluable to a civilized society. Christians, as citizens, simply seek to uphold it, as did our founders, as what it is, a legal written document based on the biblical view of covenant, one which limits the power of government, respects and upholds the laws of God upon which it is based, and our God-given liberties as free men and women. Thank you for allowing me to share these thoughts with you. May God bless each and all of you, and may his mercy be upon us all.
It's nice to see such a fine turnout for such an obscure issue. You would think this is something that we hear about on TV and the radio all the time, wouldn't you? Well, I'm happy to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity to give my perspective. I'm actually going to be talking a little bit more directly about contemporary role of religion in public life. I really didn't come prepared to kind of respond to David's revisionist history, but I'd be happy to talk about some of that when we get to the question and answer. But then again, I am a historian too, so if you'll bear with me, I'd like to start with a short history examination. I'm not going to ask for hands, but I'd like to see if you could identify the election described in the following fact pattern. The incumbent president was running for re-election, had previously served for 8 years as vice president to an extremely popular and revered chief executive. The challenger, being a Democrat, had served as a governor of a southern state and had a reputation for sexual indiscretions. The incumbent, although not an evangelical Christian himself, or even particularly devout, aligned his policies and directed his campaign to appeal to religious conservatives, hoping to garner their support, and he was successful. Prominent religious leaders attacked the challenger, alleging that many of his political positions were inconsistent with Christian values, such that a vote for the challenger would encourage secularism, atheism, at the expense of Christian morality. However, the Democratic challenger survived the attacks and went on to be elected president. But the introduction of religion as a political weapon, a political issue, was extremely polarizing and divisive to the body politic. Well, two questions arise. First, what election is this? And then second, I guess the general question we're to discuss, what are the appropriate boundaries of religion in political and public life? I guess I can invite, if anybody wants to.
Adams and Jefferson.
Exactly right. Adams and Jefferson, although I was trying to, as most of you hopefully were thinking, talk about the election of 1992 between the first Bush and President Clinton. Yes, this was the election of Adams and Jefferson. In fact, this incident led Jefferson to write his famous letter to the Danbury Baptist Association, where he stated, "Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and God, that he owes account to no other for the faith of his worship, and that the legislative powers of government should reach actions only and not opinions. I contemplate that the American people intended to erect a wall of separation between church and state." Well, on one level, the 1800 incident, as was correctly identified, demonstrates that religion has had a long impact on American public life and political life. The religious involvement in political and policy matters is certainly nothing new. As Tocqueville observed in the 1830s, he said, quote, "Religion in America takes no direct part of government in society, but it must be regarded as the first of their political institutions." Importantly, though, Tocqueville went on to write, he said that to a man, Americans assign the primary credit for the peaceful ascendancy of religion in their country to the complete separation of church and state. In fact, he said, as long as religion rests solely on the sentiments that console man in his misery, it can win the affection of the people. But Tocqueville also cautioned, I think very wisely, he said, religion cannot share the material might of those who govern without incurring some of the hatred they may inspire. Tocqueville's caution raises the question about the proper role of religion in public life. On one level, I think we could ask what the founders intended, and in fact, I think the insight of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison is very instructive. But even Jefferson, with his foresight, could not envision the phenomenal growth of religious diversity and pluralism in this country, nor the degree of governmental involvement in society, the growth of the welfare state, and the government regulation of social matters. Let me be very clear. I believe religion has an important, if not an indispensable role in public life. First and foremost, religion is an important source of community and identity for believers. If one of the leading purposes of democratic government is to attain self-fulfillment and the pursuit of happiness, then religion, like other socializing mechanisms, plays a complementary and reinforcing role in our society. For many people, their houses of worship serve as that primary mediating institution, serves as a bridge between them and society, between them and the government. Relatedly, religion supplies, I think, important external values that are necessary for a liberal, secular, and compassionate society to function. The framers believed that religion was an indispensable source of civic virtue to teach and transmit those values upon which society depended. However, values that a secular government itself could not promote. In essence, religion had a place in society to promote the values that government as a secular entity itself was disabled from doing. Religion also provides, I think, an indispensable humanizing function, ministering to those who are in need while serving as a voice for the oppressed and the downtrodden. And then, not finally, but certainly relatedly, religion acts as a critic on the culture and the government, calling the government to accountability, like Martin Luther King did, providing that Jeremiad function that all governments somewhat disdain but clearly need. Well, assuming all of that is correct, then some may suggest that the proper paradigm or ordering is for government to foster and encourage religion and religious values. In essence, the government should be able to promote religious views of the majority, to post the Ten Commandments in public buildings, to have prayer in public schools, to fund religious schools and charities, and to align other governmental policies, whether they concern abortion, gay rights, right to die, with the dominant religious ethos. Remember Newt Gingrich's contract with America. Okay. Well, I disagree. I believe that for religion to serve this indispensable role that I've identified, it must maintain a healthy distance from government and the powers that be. Religion can only serve that mediating function, that Jeremiad function, and be that voice of accountability when it remains independent, suspicious, and removed from government. Contrary to what David said, the founders, in fact, did create a secular government. The Declaration of Independence is primarily an Enlightenment document. The Constitution, the minutes to the Constitution, and also the minutes to the various ratifying conventions are bereft of any type of religious references. But all that aside, we have benefited in this country from separation of church and state. And the hallmarks of that principle are that government should not aid or support religion out of a concern that supporting dominant religions, which inevitably happens, will make religion also then dependent on government. Also, that government should not be expropriating religion or religious symbolism for its own political purposes. To not make, in Madison's words, religion an engine of civil policy. Also, the government should avoid regulating religion by basically not involving itself in religious affairs. Separation of church and state has two functions. It protects religion, and then it protects the integrity of government. And then also, even though the Constitution only affects state actors and not private individuals, that under separation of church and state, that religion should understand the limits of its own involvement in political matters. If I had to describe in a nutshell the general principle of the Constitution's First Amendment, the religion clauses, free exercise and establishment clauses, it would be that the framers intended for religion to be treated in a distinctive manner. At times, that may mean exempting religion from some neutral regulations that burden religious practices, but at other times it may mean disqualifying religious institutions from participating at the public largesse. The framers saw that religion would flourish when left to its own devices. Proven correct, I think, as religion in America is more vibrant than in any other westernized country. On any given weekend, close to 50% of Americans attend some type of religious services, Friday, Saturday, or Sunday. The framers knew that government support for religion, either financial or psychological support, would degrade religion, while it would create discord among other religious sects. The framers also knew that religion could be a corrupting influence on the government, especially when it acquires that official status, that power corrupts religion like it corrupts any other institution, and that this in turn would injure the legitimacy and the integrity of both religion and government. Okay, so what do these various principles mean on a practical level about the role of religion in public life? Well, first, I believe strongly that churches, religious organizations, using the term church generically, have a right and a responsibility to speak out on social issues, even if they're issues I disagree with, to speak out on social and moral issues, to call government to accountability. That means churches can speak out on matters like abortion, gay marriage, stem cell research. However, at the same time, religion must realize that in a democratic and pluralistic society, that there are dangers about creating division along religious lines. We cannot rest on some kind of smug assurance that America is immune from all the effects of religious tribalism that affects so many other countries, particularly once you start to politicize religion. Second, religion should resist government endorsement of religious values and symbolism. I was amazed. I wrote a friend of the court brief in the Ten Commandments case. It just came down recently from the Supreme Court. I was amazed that institutionalized religion did not universally object to the government posting of the Ten Commandments. That they did not see the danger when government starts appropriating central religious doctrine and tenets for its own purposes. I think the 220-year admonition of James Madison still rings true. He said, "Who does not see the same authority which can establish Christianity in exclusion of all other religions may then establish with the same ease a particular sect of Christians to the exclusion of all other sects." You start empowering government to use religion, it will inevitably have to pick and choose. As, by the way, you realize there are several versions of the Ten Commandments out there, and some official somewhere has to decide which one they want to choose. Third, while government must allow and provide for private religious speech in some public forums, some public places like parks and sidewalks, clearly religious speech is protected under the Free Speech Clause like other forms of speech. There may be some other governmental locations, such as public schools, with a captive audience of students where the full panoply of access may not be appropriate. That in some instances, you may need to treat religious speech somewhat differently in some contexts. And then with respect to programs like the President's faith-based initiative, while government may encourage and financially support secular programs of religious charities, I believe it should not be supporting faith-infused or religious programs of those charities. Religious charities in particular should resist government funding and regulation of anything that is a religiously infused program. Why would they want the government to be regulating something that is religiously integrated? As a Jewish friend of mine has said in respect to the faith-based initiative issues, churches need to understand that with the shekels come the shackles. Finally, let me also then just respond to the claim that the approach of separation of church and state marginalizes religion. We hear this a lot today. In essence, the separation of church and state actually invites discrimination against religious values and religious institutions. Well, I'll stick my neck out. I don't see any discrimination against religion, particularly against the dominant evangelical Christian majority in this country. In fact, I get tired of the whining I hear. Over 90% of Americans profess some type of belief in God. At least 80% identify themselves as Christian. So far as the marginalized conservative Christian voice, should be aware that there are more than 1,500, and this data is a couple years old, so I'm sure it's changed, 1,500 conservative Christian radio stations out there as compared to less than 500 NPR stations. 4 of the last presidents of the United States have identified themselves as born-again Christians. Count them for yourself. An atheist or a self-professed non-believer cannot get elected president in this country and probably can't get elected to most public office. And actually, I believe that Howard Dean, even though he likes to put his foot in his mouth, I think Howard Dean is essentially correct. One of our national political parties is effectively controlled or at least highly influenced by a conservative religious movement. Many observers claim that religious conservatives determined the last presidential election, and we cannot doubt their influence in Republican politics. Thus, religious conservatives have a prominent voice in government and in the culture. It is the Jerry Falwells and the Pat Robertsons out there who are perpetuating claims about marginalization as a way of increasing their own power and seeking to tribalize society. While religious conservatives may decry the lack of values in our society, we have our own collective self to blame. Many of the same people who urge a return to traditional values tune in to Survivor and Life with Gotti in the evenings on television. Religious leaders must understand that they, like any other area of discourse, are not immune from criticism and critique when they voluntarily interject themselves into the public debate. When religious belief is made a public issue, it becomes fair game. In conclusion, I believe religion has an active and visible presence in society, and I believe it's directly as a result of separation of church and state. Separation of church and state has allowed religion to flourish in our culture. I can improve on the statement Justice Sandra Day O'Connor made 2 weeks ago in the Ten Commandments case. She said, those who would renegotiate the boundaries between church and state must answer this very difficult question. Why would we trade a system that has served us so well for one that has served others so poorly? Thank you.
Now it's time for questions from the audience. Questions are a privilege of City Club members. Our first question will come from our board host, Corleen Kraft, our immediate past president. Corleen is a broker with the Hassan Company. Has been active in the City Club for 17 years and was also chair of the program committee. Corleen?
Well, as they say, therein lies the rub. We have countervailing pressure, and it's a question of how much countervailing pressure is good, how far is too far on either side. And I'd like to find out from each of you, can the twain meet? How much is too much? Do we take In God We Trust off of coins, or is there too much religion that can be interjected into political life? I'd like to hear what the two of you think. How can we bridge this gap that is so divisive right now?
I'll start. I actually believe many of those, what we want to call civic religion or whatever, I actually think many of those probably are violations, technical violations of the Establishment Clause. However, in the close to 10 years that I was litigating these cases, when sometimes people would call me, I had this very technical legal term for it, called them dog cases. I didn't want to litigate those cases because I think there's more damage that can be gained from something like that. I fully recognize the influence of religion in public life and in our historical traditions. And as a result, I think that there are just going to be some official representations here and there that that people would have to live with if they object to it. I have some problems, once again, with government expropriating religion for its own uses, because I think that ends up harming religion. It starts kind of watering down the significance of certain religious statements, and I'm particularly bothered by the use of the Ten Commandments. In God we trust, things like that, those don't bother me as much. I think there is some common ground. I'm sorry to answer your question. I think there is some common ground. Many years ago, when I was back in D.C., I worked with the Department of Education with religious conservatives and liberals in developing some guidelines on the appropriate rules for religious expression in public schools. And we found there was a whole lot of consensus out there. Unfortunately, it's people on the extremes many times who are wanting to make these issues more divisive than they have to be.
Well, I think there is common ground, and I think that historically there always has been. What a lot of people don't know is that the U.S. government printed the first Bibles in the nation, the U.S. government, with federal money. A lot of people don't know that Jefferson himself approved bills and money to support Christian missionaries to the Indians. That seems to be a forgotten fact. So when we talk about the separation of church and state, that phrase is not found anywhere in the Constitution of the United States. As a matter of fact, we have a document, a letter from Thomas Jefferson to Joseph Priestley, who wrote a manuscript on the foundation of the Constitution, and this was in early 1800s, very early 1800s, and he sent a manuscript to Jefferson. And Jefferson wrote him back, and in his letter he said, great history, but there's one thing you must change. Because this man said that Jefferson was the authority on the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And Jefferson wrote him back and he says, you must change this because I wasn't at the convention, I wasn't even here, I was ambassador to France. And so in 1947, the Everson versus School Board decision, that turned the First Amendment, the Establishment Clause, upside down, 180 out. I'm a Navy guy, so those of you who've been in the Navy understand what that is. They turned it upside down. And since that time, we've taken prayer out of schools, the Ten Commandments off the walls. We've made all kinds of statements and things about Christianity and the influence of Christianity, and look what we have socially now and morally in this nation. We have serious problems because of the divergence away from the meaning and the intent, the original intent of our founders. So there's lots of evidence to support that we Christians do have a valid point in our history, truly in our history, and what has been substantially strong in this nation. And it's only been since 1947 that we are incurring the kind of problems that we have. So we have to enjoin the debate on honest terminology and honest grounds. That's why I took you back to their history. This is what our founders really believed, and it is a basis for us. Yes, are we a secular society? In many regards, we are. But one can't impose itself on the other. There needs to be respect for both.
Joe Smith, City Club member. This question is particularly for Pastor Crowe, but I would appreciate Professor Green's comments. Perhaps the most serious problems facing humanity are longer term, measured in decades, not years or months. Global warming, loss of topsoil, overpopulation, antibiotic-resistant pathogens are over the immediate political horizon. A large number of conservative Christian leaders are teaching that a Holocaust ending modern society as we know it is at best just decades away and perhaps only years away. Would you comment on what those teachings and those beliefs, the influence they are having on government policy addressing the dangers I have mentioned, both what effect those attitudes and beliefs are having and what effect you believe those beliefs should have?
Thank you. First of all, I would say that the Christians that I know, the evangelical Bible-believing Christians that I know, and that includes a lot of folks across the board in various denominations, are not antagonistic to taking good care of the environment. I separate out my plastic and my glass and all of those things, and my wife does too, and we're very supportive of good environment. Do we have problems? Do I have problems? And other evangelicals have problems with people in the commercial sector who do not have regard for our environment? Yes, we do. And a lot of us let Mr. Bush know that. So we're not just all in concurrence with whatever Christian or administration is in place, whether it's Democrat or Republican. And I would say from an eschatological standpoint, which is the basis of your question, I can tell you that many, many Christians do believe that we are in the end times. And as they read the book of Revelation, Ezekiel, all of the other passages in the scripture relating to how things are coming down in world society, you have to give some credence to that because the Bible has been right more often than it's been wrong. And so here we are today in a situation wondering how that's happened. Some of you have heard of these Left Behind books that are selling millions to Christians. I personally am not in favor of the Left Behind books because it leads Christians to believe that all they have to do is escape out of responsibility and they're waiting for the rapture to take them home. And so I personally believe that we have the responsibility to occupy, in a good sense, until he comes, whenever that is. And I think it's very mistaken for a lot of Christians to stand up and say, oh, the Lord is going to return next year, or 10 years from now, or 100 years from now. I think that's presumptive.
I actually don't have any real response to it other than just kind of turn it around and just make a comment. The change in millennialist thought that existed in this country among evangelicals and fundamentalists is actually one of the reasons for the rise of the religious right. That traditionally, at least during the early part of the 20th century, you found conservative Christians who really were adopting more of an otherworldly approach and saw that involvement in politics was either a waste of time or was beneath them or something like that. And it really was in the 1970s, a lot of people assign both the prayer and Bible reading decisions of the 60s and then abortion decision in Roe v. Wade as kind of the wake-up call for many conservative Christians who realized that their kind of otherworldliness was not going to work in the culture and that they need to become more active in the culture.
I remember the club, in view of the fact that the Bible, if you suggest being the fundamental book to which government and everything should refer, essentially is based upon a Jewish God, which the Christians have accepted, why wouldn't it be more appropriately a Jewish nation rather than a Christian nation?
With regard to the same God that we worship as the Jews, we do believe it is a Jewish nation as well. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but the Jews, when they came to the United States, were less than 1% at the time of our founding documents. Do we have disregard for them? No. Some of my best friends in town are very Jewish, and I have come to know a lot of them because of my efforts with Restore America to get Christians to vote. So I am very appreciative of our Jewish brethren.
Ray Polanyi, a City Club member. I'm somewhat disturbed by the Christian fundamentalists seeming to forget that democracy, the first working democracy, occurred somewhere 400 years before Christ in the city of Athens in Greece. I think we should not forget that. And I also think that we should remember, as the gentleman said, that Jesus Christ was born as a Jew, lived as a Jew, and died as a Jew. And by the way, this was told to me by our priest, a Catholic priest. So I really think that we better remember that democracy, of which we seem to be the most present example, predates Jesus Christ by about 400 to 500 years. And the Jews were around probably another 2,500 years before that.
I'd like to start with an observation. We need not look any further than in contemporary history than Rwanda, than Yugoslavia, than today's Middle East, pick a country, to see that the ills worked on mankind by one religious group trying to dominate or impose their particular version of ideology on everybody else has led to more woes for believer and non-believer alike than any other single factor. So is not the issue not whether the U.S. government is based on principles laid out in the Bible, but the imposition of a particularly narrow and self-righteous and evangelical interpretation of that idea on those who do not so believe?
Well, my response is I don't know that the Christians are trying to impose that on anyone. We do believe that we have a right to vote as other citizens and reflect our values into representative government, which is what our founders set up. And that's all we're saying. What we hear, for instance, Robert Reich, former Clinton Labor Secretary, and Bill Moyers have both said the radical Christian right is not much different from radical Islam, as they want to establish a Christian Taliban in the U.S. Well, those talk about inflammatory statements that concern Christians. We do more and have historically to establish love for our neighbor and for people who are hurting around the world. It seems like the secular press does not want to share the billions and billions of dollars that come out of our pockets to support missionaries around the world, and not just to proclaim the gospel, but to help them in the needs that they have. And it's somehow the Christians are becoming seen as the villains, when in fact we really have worked diligently not to be. And it's only when we've raised our heads to slightly object a little bit on our votes with regard to some of the moral issues in our nation that we're now being vilified as being bad folks. So I don't think we're trying to do anything but speak our values into representative government in this nation. We're not trying to impose a theocracy, as some people are suggesting. We're not trying to impose that at all. We're simply trying to say that we have a right to vote and to speak up in this country as well as anyone else.
Let me agree with David to a certain extent. as I said, I believe that people of faith have a responsibility, a right to speak out, to be involved in political issues, policy issues. Clearly they should be, and I don't think anybody would suggest the disenfranchisement of people because of their religious beliefs. I would go to court so quickly on that as many other people would. And I believe very strongly that religion, Christianity, whatever, has done far more good in society than it has done bad, without a doubt. What concerns me as a Christian is when I saw many years ago an organization formed called the Christian Coalition that seems to suggest it represents the quote-unquote Christian perspective. I think the conservative religious right, whatever you want to call it, has shot themselves in the foot. On one hand, they have seemed to put the mantle of Christianity on their own back, saying we are the Christians. But then the policies that they sometimes advocate, many other Christians, myself, feel are inconsistent. And so that, of course, has an effect that many people will then point fingers and say, well, if that's the Christian perspective, then I disagree, I dislike that. And so I think there needs to be some self-healing that goes on with the religious right over this issue. And they're not doing a very good job on it when just a few years ago you have people like Pat Robertson talking about, well, you know, Methodists and Presbyterians really aren't Christians. That certainly then starts to make a lot of people concerned that, yes, that it does start devolving into a very particular view of Christianity.
I'd like to add one comment to that, if I could. I have never been a member of the Christian Coalition. Never. I'm a little concerned when in fact, I wince a lot of times when I see Pat Robertson or Jerry Falwell being the ones on TV supposedly as the spokesman for the Christians. I don't think they're good spokesmen for all of us. Now, I'm not trying to cut them down. I'm just simply trying to say that maybe we should be listening to Robert George, who is a professor at Princeton University. Maybe we should be listening to some of those others that the media somehow forgets to bring on board because they have very intelligent arguments to make. So Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell, and some of the others out there that the media loves to spring forward do not speak for all evangelical, fundamental, and charismatic Christians, and mainline churches as well. They do not.
First, I'd like to say my name is Ted Raphael, City Club member. I appreciate the previous remarks as a Greek American who was raised as a Presbyterian. My questions. For Mr. Crowe and Mr. Green, they're complementary questions. Mr. Crowe, what types of public policies would you consider a violation of separation of church and state? And Mr. Green, what policies would you consider within the bounds of separation of church and state with regard to religious policies within the context of what we've been talking about?
Very good question. I'm trying to buy some time. The doctrine of separation of church and state, as Steve and I probably disagree about maybe quite a bit, maybe not as much. We'd probably have to discuss that a little bit. As I said, is a relatively new doctrine in this country starting in 1947, and it turned it upside down. I do not believe that there is a separation of church and state in the sense that Christians can't speak out in public, the Ten Commandments can't be posted in public. There are efforts being made across the country to squelch prayer at the beginning of any kind of public meeting. There's been an effort to shut down prayer at commencement ceremonies by a Christian who may want to make a reference or comment, can't use the name Jesus, can't use the name God. I don't think that's what separation of church and state, and when I've gone back, and one of the PowerPoint presentations I make is to go through all the iterations of introduction from James Madison on, and how the first Congress dealt with that on both the House and the Senate side, and when they came to a decision, and what Joseph Story said about that later on, and what others, including Rehnquist, have said about the separation of church and state as it is being said today. There was never the intent of our founders, never their intent, to separate the influence of Christianity or religion from government. That was never their intent. Their intention, which they made very, very clear, was that the federal government was not to particularly choose out a specific denomination that was reflected by one of those colonies and make it the state church. That was what the Danbury Baptists were concerned about, and others were quite concerned about, and that's our position too, is that the federal government is not supposed to do that, but it is supposed to uphold the First Amendment as the original founders intended.
To answer your question, I guess the way I would answer it would be to say, I would like to know by what right. By what right is government empowered to act religiously in the first instance? And that's what I believe the Establishment Clause basically says. It says government can speak politically, socially, whatever, but it cannot speak religiously. And so I think that's where the presumption, we deal with presumptions a lot in the law, that's where the presumption and the burden first rests. Government needs to justify. It can't be presumed. I went to the Supreme Court arguments on the Ten Commandments, and no one was even asking this question. Everybody assumed the government could use the Ten Commandments. The question was, in what context were appropriate? And I was wanting to jump up and scream before they would drag me out, I'm sure, to say, wait, you're not asking the first question. The first question is, how is government authorized in first instance to use religion in this way? There are many ways, of course, that government can partner with religious organizations to do social good. I think that's very appropriate. I think it's appropriate for government to actually recognize some strengths that religious institutions, like other institutions, may have and work with them, but government should not be trying to advance religious doctrine. Real quickly, I just have to respond to a couple of things he said. Separation of church and state is a phrase that you can point to and say, well, it's not in the Constitution. Well, free press isn't in the Constitution. Separation of powers is not in the Constitution. Checks and balances are not in the Constitution. I could go on. There are many, many constitutional concepts we have that are not verbatim in the Constitution. Roger Williams came up with a comparable phrase back in the 17th century. I quoted Tocqueville. He used the phrase. U.S. Supreme Court used it in 1878. It's been around a long time, folks. It was really not questioned. And the high watermark, that something happened when the Supreme Court started identifying with these principles is just bad history. I went back and did some research many years ago before the school prayer decisions of 62 and 63, and the data that was available in the 1950s showed that less than 1/3 of the public schools had any kind of organized religion. This is 10 years before the Supreme Court found it unconstitutional. It was on its way out. Let's not blame the Supreme Court for the decay of American society.
Andy Linehan, City Club member. I've got a couple related questions for Pastor Crowe. The first one is, you seem to be advocating an increased recognition of Christian values in the public sector. What's your message to Hindus, Buddhists, Jews about their role in American society as opposed to Christians' role in American society?
Just as equal as ours. If you go to our website, you'll find that what we are addressing is, my message is to the Christians. I'm trying to show them that of the 52 million voter-eligible, Bible-believing evangelical Christians in America, only 27 million voted in 2000. It was up to 33 million. So there's 19 million of them out there who are not being good citizens and exercising their vote. Our effort is really not to try and say anything about anyone else. It's to say that we need to get our own house in order and be better citizens. That's what we're saying. And we're not trying to downplay anyone else whatsoever. We're not trying to convert them. We have our views and our beliefs, as do every group, including the secular humanists. Torcaso versus Watkins recognize that it is a religion. And so we're simply saying that we Christians need to clean up our act a little bit and be more involved and be better citizens. That's all.
Follow-on question, if I may. On a more practical current events issue, would you please comment on the concept of separating civil unions from marriage, that is leading civil unions as a civil function of the government and marriage a religious function of churches? Does that not seem an appropriate way to divide church and state in this matter?
Are you asking me?
Yes.
Yes. Our position is this, that we believe from the Scripture and from all history that marriage is between a man and a woman only. And we believe that calling it civil unions and entering into that relationship really hurts marriage in this country, which has been hurt bad enough. And that, frankly, when you do that, you've created a situation in every state where you're going to see adopted children go into same-sex relationships, men, men, women, women, and we don't think that is healthy, and all the sociological, all the evidence demonstrates that children need a mother and a father. Young men need a difference, and so we're opposed to civil unions in any form. If you look at the laws, people who want to enter into some kind of relationship with the advantages of that, there are plenty of laws out there that they can use to make that happen.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Brad Brokaw, a City Club member. The question is primarily for you, Professor Green. I was with you most of your speech until the end when you referenced I Have a Scream, Howard Dean, and I'm wondering if the name calling isn't valuable for the discussion. And my question is, by saying the religious right has co-opted the GOP, could you acknowledge that for years then, possibly African American churches, synagogues, and other religious organizations similarly co-opted the Democratic Party, specifically how the Catholic Church helped elect Kennedy in 1960?
I don't think you see the same degree of influence in the Democratic Party that you would see in the Republican Party. The point of raising that was not to evaluate it one way or the other. The point was I was responding to the anticipated statements that religion has been marginalized, that the religious right, the conservative Christian voice, is a despised, dispirited, powerless entity in our society. And the whole point was to say, I don't think that's true. I'm not saying whether that's good or bad. I fully acknowledge liberal churches, African American churches, unions, gay rights organizations, whomever. There are a lot of other groups who are in the Democratic Party too. I mean, that's fine. But when people say that somehow the conservative Christians are not getting the opportunity to participate in the culture and express their views, I just don't find that very convincing.
We'll take one more question.
Hi, Joanne Kahn, City Club member. First, I just wanted to object to the idea that liberals were moral anarchists, which you had in your speech. And then my question has to do with your feelings about hate crimes. You talked a lot about your desire to have expression of Christian beliefs in public places and in schools in different ways. And I'd like to know how you would deal with issues of pressure on minority groups in areas and hate crimes that might be inspired by that sort of expression.
You're asking me, I assume? Yes. First of all, that statement was by Judge Bork, not by me. So if you have an issue, you need to take it up with Judge Bork. Secondly, there is so much talk, and this is one of the problems that I have with the secular media and the left, always trying to blame the Christians as being the people who really don't care, and that the hate crimes, if you can give me a list of any kind of hate crimes in the state of Oregon that have been registered in the last 10 years, I'd like to see that list. You will find that Christians are the most tolerant people in the world. You have been told there's something else, but Christians have been extremely tolerant. And now what we find is that there's a great deal of intolerance towards us in taking any position that we have to defend ourselves. And for years we have not. We have been good citizens. And so vilifying the Christians with regard to hate crimes, go back to Wyoming, we could talk about that. And those fellows involved.